Hi, physiology students, and welcome to part A of chapter 17. This will be on the cardiovascular system, the heart, and then chapter 18 is on all the blood vessels. And on Thursday, we'll go over part B. So some of this is a lot of anatomy review. So you'll remember that the heart is a transport system consisting of two side-by-side pumps, where the right side receives oxygen-poor blood from tissues, pumps the blood to the lungs to get rid of CO2. It will pick up O2 in the lungs via the pulmonary circuit, and then the left side will receive the oxygenated blood from the lungs, and the left side of the heart will pump blood back to the body tissues via the systemic circuit. So here are the receiving chambers of the heart. The right atrium receives blood returning from the systemic circuit. Left atrium receives blood returning from the pulmonary circuit. And then the ventricles are the pumping chambers of the heart on the bottom. The right ventricle pumps the blood through the pulmonary circuit, and the left ventricle pumps the blood through the systemic circuit. So here's just a review of the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit, and showing how blood enters the right atrium, goes to the right ventricle, goes out through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen, returns back to the heart via the left atrium into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle pumps oxygenated blood out of the aorta to all of the body's system cells. So the heart is approximately the size of the fist. It weighs less than a pound. It's located in the mediastinum space between your second rib and fifth intercostal space, just slightly left of the mid-sternal line, on the superior surface of the diaphragm. So it sits kind of right on top of the diaphragm. It's anterior, so it's in front of your vertebral column, but posterior to the sternum. So here's where the heart is located in that mediastinum, just slightly left of the midline, on top of the diaphragm, between the second rib and kind of the body of the sternum region. And again, it's just located slightly left. Here's a cross-section view of the location of the heart in the mediastinum, showing how the vertebral bodies lie behind it and how the lungs kind of form kind of a space around the heart. The base of the heart leans towards the right shoulder, the apex points towards the left hip, and the apical impulse is palpated between the fifth and sixth ribs just below your left nipple. So you're able to kind of feel a little bit of an impulse or kind of a pulsating of the heart there. So here's the apex of the heart, the base, so your heart kind of is turned and lies back on itself. There's your pulmonary trunk, the aorta, your superior vena cava, and here's the pericardium that's cut to reveal the heart inside of it. The pericardium is a double-walled sac that surrounds the heart. It's made of two layers, the superficial fibrous pericardium and the deep two-layered serous pericardium, where the parietal layer will line the internal surface of the fibrous pericardium, and then the visceral pericardium, epicardium, is just the external surface of the heart. These two layers are separated by a fluid-filled space called the pericardial cavity. And this space just helps to decrease friction. So here's just a look at the walls of the heart, showing the endocardium, myocardium, epicardium. That's the wall of the heart. Here's the pericardial cavity, and then the parietal layer and the fibrous pericardium that make up the pericardium wall. Pericarditis, so remember itis is any inflammation. So this is inflammation of that pericardium layer. It roughens the membrane surfaces, causing a pericardial friction rub or a creaking sound. It can be heard through a stethoscope. A cardiac tamponade is excess fluid that leaks into the pericardial space, and that can compress the heart's pumping ability. In the treatment, you need to actually draw the fluid out of the cavity, usually with a syringe. So the layers of the heart, we have the epicardium, the most superficial layer. That's also the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. The myocardium will be the circular or spiral bundles of those contractile cardiac muscle cells. The cardiac skeleton is just a name for the crisscrossing, interlacing layer of the connective tissue that will anchor the cardiac muscle fibers, support the great vessels and valves, and limit the spread of action potentials to specific paths through the heart. So here's a look at the cardiac muscle bundles and how they're circularly and spirally arranged in the myocardium of the heart. The endocardium is the innermost layer. This will line the heart chambers and covers the cardiac skeleton of the valves. And here's again the layers of the pericardium and the heart wall that you can review there. The internal chambers, again, you have two superior atria, two inferior ventricles. The interatrial septum is the wall between atria. The fossa ovalis is a remnant of the foramen ovale of the fetal heart. So during fetal development, there's a hole in the interatrial septum. And with the first breath, the change in pressure or intake of air will close that hole and it will become the fossa ovalis. And the interventricular septum is the wall separating the ventricles. So you should be really familiar with the gross anatomy of the heart because it'll directly play a role in when we talk about the cardiac cycle, which is the big physiological theme that we'll get to. So just take a moment to make sure you are well familiar with the gross anatomy internally and externally. On the surface of the heart, we have the coronary sulcus, which lies in the atrioventricular groove, which is a depression between the atria and ventricles. It will encircle the junction of the atria and ventricles. And then we have an anterior and posterior interventricular sulcus, which are grooves, either on the anterior side or the posterior side of the heart. And you can see those sulci there, the grooves, and within those grooves usually lies some sort of coronary artery or coronary vein. And you can see here the posterior surface of the heart, the right coronary artery and the coronary sulcus. Here's the coronary sinus, which is the big kind of catch-all for the coronary veins. So again, be very familiar with external and internal anatomy of the heart, which hopefully is a review. So your atria, again, receive blood. They're the receiving chambers. They're smaller. They contribute little to the propulsion of blood. The auricles are appendages that increase atrial volume. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the body. The posterior portion of it contains these ridges formed by pectinate muscles. And the posterior and anterior regions are separated by what we call the crista terminalis. 3 veins will empty directly into the right atrium, the superior and inferior vena cava, and then the coronary sinus, which returns blood from the coronary veins. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. You have pectinate muscles found only in the auricles, and 4 pulmonary veins will return oxygenated blood from the lungs. So here's another look at those pulmonary veins, and then the superior and inferior vena cava entered into the right atria. The ventricles, then, we call them the discharging chambers. They're on the inferior surface of the heart. They make up most of the volume of the heart. The right ventricle makes up most of the heart's anterior surface because the heart is kind of rotate on itself. And the left ventricle makes up the heart's posterior inferior surface. Trabeculae carneae are irregular ridges of muscle on the ventricular walls, and papillary muscles will project into the ventricular cavity, and they anchor the chordae tendineae that will be attached to heart valves. Ventricles have thicker walls than the atria. These are the pumps of the heart. The right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary trunk, and the left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. So again, here are the pulmonary valves you can see here, and they will open and close from the right and left ventricle as they pump blood into the rest of the body. Here's a look at a cadaver heart, and it's always fun to see a real life look at this heart. You can kind of see here, there's the myocardium of the left ventricle, the ascending aorta, the superior vena cava, entering the right atrium. And you can see the fossa ovalis, which again is a remnant of a foramen that existed between atria during fetal development. This hole exists to shunt blood away from the lungs that aren't quite fully developed in a fetal heart. Another maybe kind of clear look of a cadaver heart, you can see here the aorta, the 3 branches coming off the aorta, and then a little bit more of the tricuspid valve, the cusps, and the chordae tendineae, which are anchored on these papillary muscles. Here's a great animation of a rotating heart section that you guys can take a look at. More gross anatomy of the heart. Again, it's showing an anterior view, showing some of these anterior interventricular arteries that come down in the anterior interventricular sulcus. Here's a right coronary artery in the coronary sulcus. So again, just a great look at a cadaver heart that's been expertly dissected, which is kind of cool to see. So your heart valves ensure unidirectional, so one-way blood flow through the heart. They'll open and close in response to pressure changes. You have two major types of valves, your atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. No valves are found between major veins and atria. This isn't a problem because the inertia of incoming blood will prevent any backflow. The heart contractions will also compress venous openings. So from the pulmonary veins in the superior and inferior vena cava, there's just natural inertia of incoming blood, which will prevent any backflow. So there's no need for heart valves there. So here's a cross section of the heart showing the heart valves. Here's the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves leading into those respective great vessels. And then here is the tricuspid and mitral valve. So the tricuspid's on the right side of the heart and the mitral is the left atrioventricular valve. So your tricuspid valve is made up of three cusps between the right atria and right ventricle. The mitral or bicuspid valve is made up of two cusps and lies between the left atria and ventricle. The chordae tendineae anchors the cusps of the AV valves to the papillary muscles that function to hold the valve flaps in a closed position, which will prevent the flaps from everting, kind of switching their direction back into the atria. So here's a look at a cadaver heart, and then this is a really cool picture of the chordae tendineae attached to the tricuspid valve, and here's the papillary muscle at the bottom. So just an amazing picture graph of what that actually looks like. Here's just a look at the function of the atrioventricular valve. So blood returns to the heart and it will fill up the atria, which will press against the AV valves. The increased pressure will force the AV valves to open, which will fill up the ventricles with blood. The AV valves flaps will hang limply into the ventricles. And when the atria contract, it'll force any additional blood into the ventricles. The ventricles will then contract, forcing blood against the AV valve cusps. So the AV valves will then slam shut. And that's the first kind of heart sound you hear in a stethoscope. And then the papillary muscles will contract and the chordae tendineae will tighten, which will prevent the valve flaps from everting back into the atria. So they'll stay closed when the ventricles will eject their blood. The semilunar valves then prevent backflow from the major arteries back into the ventricles. They will open and close in response to pressure changes. Each valve consists of three cusps that roughly resemble a half moon. The pulmonary semilunar valve is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic semilunar valve is located between your left ventricle and the aorta. So as your ventricles contract and interventricular pressure rises, due to the increase in blood and just the contracting, blood is pushed up against the semilunar valves and forces them to open right before the ejection of blood. As ventricles relax then and the interventricular pressure falls back down when blood is ejected, blood will flow back from the arteries, which will fill the cusps of the semilunar valves and forces them to slam shut. And that slamming shut of your semilunar valves is the second heart sound you hear in the lub-dub, lub-dub. Two conditions severely weaken the heart. Incompetent valve, which was where blood backflows, so the heart has to repump the same blood over and over again, or valvular stenosis is a stiff flap of a valve that will constrict the opening, so the heart needs to exert more force to pump the blood. A defective valve can be replaced with something mechanical, animal, or a cadaver valve. So this is the pathway of blood through the heart, and I'll let you guys read through this on your own. This is through the right side of the heart, and again, you should be very familiar with the pathway of blood through the heart on the right side and the left side, and which side pumps to pulmonary circulation, the right side of the heart, and the left side of the heart pumps blood through to the systemic circulation. So this is showing you how blood flows through the heart. And I love this picture because it's showing with arrows and then colors the deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood in blue. So here's blood going from the right ventricle to the lungs and then showing the capillaries, where it will pick up oxygen from the lungs and come back to the heart. And then this shows the blood coming back to the heart in the left atrium to the left ventricle, out the aorta, and delivering oxygen-rich blood delivered to the body via the systemic circuit. And then the capillaries will take the oxygen-poor blood, the deoxygenated blood, back to the right atrium of the heart. So the heart, again, is a double pump, each side supplying its own circuit. And this is a great picture just to review how blood flows through the heart, through the pulmonary circuit, back through the left side of the heart and out to the systemic circuit and back again. So I really like this diagram that helps explain that. The pathway of blood through the heart, a little bit more information about that. Equal volumes of blood are pumped to the pulmonary and systemic circuits. The pulmonary circuit is short, low pressure circulation, whereas the systemic circuit is long, high friction circulation. The anatomy of the ventricles reflects their differences. The left ventricle walls are about 3 times thicker than the right, and they will pump with a greater pressure. And you can see that here, the left ventricle is much thicker than the right ventricle. Coronary circulation is the blood supply to the heart muscle itself. It's the shortest circulation in the body. It's delivered when the heart is relaxed, and the left ventricle receives most of the coronary blood supply because it has to perform the highest kind of contraction of all the heart muscles. Both the left and right coronary arteries will come off of the base of the aorta and supply arterial blood to the heart. They will encircle the heart in the coronary sulcus, and they'll have different coronary arteries that branch off of them. Arteries will contain many anastomoses or junctions, which will provide additional routes for blood delivery that cannot compensate for coronary artery occlusion. So if one is blocked, and anastomoses cannot compensate for any sort of blockage. The heart receives about 1/20 of the body's entire blood supply, which I think is very interesting. That's a lot of blood. The left coronary artery supplies your interventricular septum, the anterior ventricular walls, the left atrium, and the posterior wall of the left ventricle. These are the 2 branches of it. The anterior interventricular artery is one that's often blocked, which could lead to a heart attack or a myocardial infarction. The right coronary artery supplies the right atrium and most of the right ventricle. It has 2 branches, the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. So this is just to look at the arteries that supply blood supply to the heart. And again, this anterior interventricular artery is one that can be commonly blocked, and it can produce a lot of damage because this supplies blood to the left ventricle. And if your left ventricle doesn't get blood supply as well as it should, it will greatly decrease the amount of blood that it can eject. The coronary veins will just collect all the blood from the capillary beds and return them back to the right atrium. We have the coronary sinus, which empties right into the right atrium, which is formed by the merging of these cardiac veins, and several anterior cardiac veins will empty directly into the right atrium. So this is just to look at the heart's drainage and how they will all empty eventually into the right atrium. More look at the gross anatomy of the heart, showing the drainage from the pulmonary sinus, which drains all the veins, and that'll go directly into the right atrium. Angina pectoris is the thoracic pain caused by a fleeting deficiency in blood delivery to the myocardium. The cells could be weakened, and myocardial infarction is a heart attack, and this is prolonged coronary artery blockage, where areas of cell death are repaired with non-contractile scar tissue. So your cardiac muscle fibers, hopefully this is a review from histology a little bit. Your cardiac muscle cells are striated, short, branched, fat, they're interconnected. There's one central nucleus, lots of mitochondria. There's Z discs, A bands, and I bands all present in a typical sarcomere. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is a little bit simpler than in skeletal muscle. The intercalated discs are connecting junctions between the cardiac cells that will contain desmosomes and gap junctions. Desmosomes hold cells together, which prevent cells from separating during contraction, and gap junctions allow the ions to pass from cell to cell, so they will electrically couple adjacent cells together, and this allows the heart to be what we call a functional syncytium, which is a single coordinated unit. The intercellular space between cells has a connective tissue matrix called the endomysium, where there's lots of numerous capillaries, and it will connect cardiac muscle to the cardiac skeleton, which will give cells something to pull against. So here's just a look at the cardiac muscle histology, showing these gap junctions. They're electrically connected myocytes, and then the desmosomes, which keep the myocytes from pulling apart. Another look at just heart muscle, how it's branching and how it contains the sarcomere, what you would find in a skeletal muscle cell, but it's a little bit more simpler in design. Similarities with skeletal muscle. So the muscle contraction will be preceded by a depolarizing action potential. So the depolarization will travel down the T-tubule, causing the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. So far, this sounds like skeletal muscle. And then we get an excitation contraction coupling where calcium will bind to troponin, which causes the actin and myosin filaments to slide. Some differences, though, is that some cardiac muscle cells are self-excitable, meaning there's contractile cells, which are responsible for contraction, and pacemaker cells, which are non-contractile cells that spontaneously depolarize. It will initiate depolarization of the entire heart. It does not need the nervous system stimulation, which is in contrast to skeletal muscle fibers. So your heart contracts as a unit. All of the cardiomyocytes contract as a unit, or none will contract at all. This ensures effective pumping action. And as you remember, skeletal muscles contract independently. The influx of calcium from the extracellular fluid will trigger calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The depolarization opens slow calcium channels in the sarcolemma, allowing calcium to enter the cell, and then extracellular calcium then causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release its intracellular calcium. Tetanic contractions cannot occur in cardiac muscles. They have longer absolute refractory periods than skeletal muscles. It's almost as long as the contraction itself. So this prevents a tetany type contraction where the muscle would be stimulated in a constant state of contraction. This kind of refractory period allows the heart to relax and fill as needed to be an efficient pump. The heart relies almost exclusively on aerobic respiration, which means it cannot function without oxygen. So the cardiac muscle will have more mitochondria. Both types of tissue can use other fuel sources. So cardiac is more adaptable to other fuels, including lactic acid, but it must have oxygen first and foremost. So that's why if your coronary arteries get blocked and the heart does not have oxygen, the heart will die very quickly. So here are some key differences between skeletal and cardiac muscle. It's just an important chart to know, kind of as well as a summary of the skeletal muscle as well. And that's the end of part A, and I will see you guys on Thursday for part B. Thanks for listening.